In part 2 of the router table video, I finished up with all the lengths of wood for the table frame cut and ready for the next step. The legs are made as pairs using the rails, and then stretchers connect to the rails to form the frame. Fair warning, I'll be mixing both inches and millimeters throughout this video, as I find the smaller measurements easier with metric units. At the top of the leg, rabbets are cut to sandwich the rail in between the two leg pieces, and dadoes are cut at the bottom of the legs to once again sandwich in the rails. I used some test pieces to set the depth of the cut to 19mm, which is half the thickness of my rails. Once this was set, I clamped a stop block down on the sled to set the rabbet length to 66mm, the width of the rail. I did a test on two pieces and everything lined up great. Now to repeat this on the actual legs. The first pair of legs came out perfect. However, after repeating this 7 more times, I don't know how, but the table saw blade moved a little bit higher and my rabbets turned out a bit too big. I'll be able to fix this by using some slivers of wood to fill the gap, so it's not a deal breaker, but annoying nonetheless. I even lowered the blade height to try and resolve this, but it persisted for the remaining cuts, something to be investigated later. The dado cuts begin at 9 inches up from the bottom of the legs. Once again I clamped a stop block down on the sled and then performed the bottom cut on all 8 legs, including a test piece as well. Next was to move that stop block along 66mm, which is the width of the rails. I made sure that the outside of the cut was where the 66mm ended, as I needed to take into account the saw blade width. I cut my test piece first to make sure my stop block was in the correct position, and it was perfect. So I then repeated this on all 8 pieces. This way I can visually see where the boundaries are for my remaining cuts. So after doing this to all 8 legs, I now have the major joints cut and I'm one step closer to assembling the frame of the router table. As you can see here, the depth issue I had with the saw blade repeated itself all the way through. Not a showstopper, but a little annoying nonetheless. At this point it's time to do a little sanding. The table saw blade doesn't leave the cleaner's cut, so I'm going to smooth these out with some manual sanding. I'm not aiming for perfect here, just to level out the major bumps. I'm also going to be using my orbital sander to go over the legs and smooth them over. I'd rather do that now before the legs are assembled, which saves me having to sand around the corners later. I'm not aiming for a perfect finish here, just tidying up the legs before the next stage. The stretchers are going to be connected to the rails using lag screws. The screws are going through the rails first, so I'm going to drill these holes now ahead of time. To ensure they are properly positioned, I'm going to make a template that I can clamp down on the rails and drill through. The holes will be located 85mm from the end of the rail, and they will be spaced apart 18mm from the edges of the rail. I'm using my drill press here to make sure the holes I'm creating in my template are straight and correctly positioned. Once those holes are done, I decide to cut this template in half, as my drill bit is not long enough to go through both the template and the rail. To do this, I'm using double-sided tape on the template to stick it to my sled to hold it in place while it is cut. Apart from keeping my hands away from the blade isn't actually big enough to cut all the way through, so I'll flip it over and stick it down again, repeat the cut, and hey presto, I have 2 templates now and all 10 fingers are still attached to my hands. With the template created, I use it to mark where the holes need to be placed on the rails. The 2 rails in the bottom of the legs need holes on both ends, and the upper rails only need holes at one end. This is because there is no stretcher on the top front to provide access to the router. Once again I get the drill press out and proceed to drill all the holes. I have a scrap piece of plywood on the bottom so the wood doesn't tear out when the drill bit exits the wood. Due to the length I'm drilling, I also have to stop near the end and then lower the drill bit into the hole to be able to make it all the way through. Now it's time to start assembling the legs together. When lining things up, I use my air compressor to blow out all the fine dust from the gluing surfaces. It's amazing exactly how much comes out from the joints to be glued. I need to glue and clamp the rails to one of the legs, and then when it's dried I can then glue the other half of the leg, resulting in the rails being sandwiched in between the legs. Now at this point in time I don't have a lot of good clamps, so I'll need to do one side first and then wait before being able to do the other side. The order I decide to glue these in will be the inside leg to the rail first. The reasoning behind this has to do with the sloppy holes I ended up with after realizing the table saw depth was too much on my dadoes and rabbets. If I do the inside legs first, then I know that the stretches will be correctly spaced apart and the table should be square. I'll make some shims to fill the gaps on the outside legs and we'll see how it goes. When I was doing the gluing of the outside legs, I found I needed to use an extra clamp to align the legs to allow me to clamp the top rail to the rabbet. On the second set of legs, it was so tight that I ended up using a ratchet strap. Now while this did work, I failed to realize the softness of the pine wood and hence one of the corners became rounded due to the force being applied. If I did this again, I would need to create some corner protectors to prevent this from happening. But anyways, it's another lesson learned. While I was waiting for the glue to dry, I decided to cut those shims I was going to need. I had a spare length of wood left over that was the correct width, so I fastened some blocks to it and went about cutting these thin slices on the table saw, going slow and making sure my hands were safe from the blade. I wasn't sure how many I needed, so I cut up 5 strips. I gave them a quick sanding with the orbital sander and then used a table saw sled to cut them all to an equal size, slightly larger than what I actually required. Next up, I needed to make sure the shims were the right size for the gaps in the dadoes and rabbets. I'll be honest, this took much longer than expected, but once everything seemed to line up, I glued the shim into the outside leg first and left it to dry. Once it was dry, then I used my handsaw to trim the excess piece off the shim, then cleaning it up with some sandpaper and giving it another blow with the air compressor. Once I'm happy that the legs will fit snugly, I apply a liberal amount of glue on both pieces, sandwich them together and secure them with clamps. After all that hard work, here's the first pair of legs all glued up. There's a few obvious gaps where I had the table saw depth mishap, and the shims didn't completely fill the holes, however it does feel sturdy. Now, I know I could mix some sawdust and glue and fill those holes, however, going to this project I knew it wasn't going to be perfect and I want to leave it in that state. I want to keep it as a reminder of my journey, and over time I'll be able to compare these past projects and see my progression. Hopefully it's better. Once I completed the second pair of legs, for some reason one of the outside pieces moved slightly as the glue was setting. Perhaps something to do with the clamp force being applied, or maybe the pieces weren't exactly flat. Something to be more aware of in the future when doing glue ups. With both pair of legs completed, I can hold them up next to each other and they do seem to be mostly identical. It's a good feeling to get to this stage and see actual progress. Holding the legs next to me really gives me a better feeling of how big the table will be when finished. Do you have similar experiences like this working on projects when reaching different stages? Let me know in the comments below. With that in mind, I've done as much as I can this week, so you have to tune in to the next episode to see how the stretches are joined to the legs. I hope you're enjoying these router table videos as much as I am making the table. Until next time, bye!